I'm Teisha Bader in for Mark Golub. And in the news, a new survey released just ahead of Israel's 69th Independence Day by the JPPI, the Jewish People Policy Institute, on pluralism. The JPPI is a think tank created by the Jewish Agency. They released their findings from a major survey of 1,300 Israeli Jews and Arabs and their feelings about identity, religious beliefs, coexistence, and other issues. Noah Slepkov is a fellow at the JPPI who worked on crafting this survey and analyzing its results. He joins us now over the phone from Modi'in. Thank you so much, Noah, for joining us here on JBS.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you. So first of all, tell us a bit about the JPPI and what you actually do.
Well, the Jewish People Policy Institute is, as you said, it's a think tank started by the Jewish Agency. And basically, the idea behind the think tank is to say there should be an organization in the Jewish world that's looking at the future of the Jewish people and making policy that will help ensure a thriving and united Jewish future.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the questions that were asked of those surveyed, the results of which you released just last week. And again, those surveyed, we want to remind people, included Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. So you asked in those two communities, should those two communities live together? Now, we should just say that within Israel, there are a number of cities where Arabs and Jews live together, like Jerusalem and Jaffa. Although that doesn't always mean they live next door to each other, but they are coexisting in the same city. So was the question about living together in the same city, like in those examples of like a Jerusalem or a Jaffa?
Yeah, I mean, most cities in Israel are very mixed. Even in populations, like in the city I live in, Modi'in, there isn't a large population of Arabs that live in the city, but my children's doctors are Arabs, my pharmacist is an Arab, and I'm, working with professional Arabs all the time in the community.
Okay.
So it's very rare in Israel to have a city that is completely not mixed. But when we ask this question, in your opinion, should Arabs and Jews live in mixed neighborhoods? Both Jews and Arabs, around 30% of both said they should. So a large majority of both Jews and Arabs said they shouldn't. But what's interesting about this, when asked should Jews and Arabs have their children in the same school, there was a more significant amount of Arabs and Jews who actually want their children to study in the same school. In fact, more Arabs than Jews, but still both Jews and Arabs would rather their children study in the same school than have themselves live in mixed communities, which is a very ironic finding, but positive nonetheless.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. So, I mean, do you understand that as sort of saying, well, perhaps these two communities are not quite ready to live together on a daily basis, but they do want exposure. One community does want the exposure of the other community and is sort of open to some sort of coexistence. Is that how you take it, or how do you view those results?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is, we asked the question, should Haredim, that is Ultra-Orthodox Jews, and secular Jews live in the same, live in mixed communities? And what you would think, what your intuition would say is that, well, the Haredim already live in very secluded neighborhoods without secular people. So you'd think that the Haredim wouldn't want to live in communities with secular people because they choose not to live in communities with secular people. And secular people who tend to be more liberal and open would want to live in a community where you have all types of people, including ultra-Orthodox. But the findings are the opposite, that Haredim are actually open to living with people who are secular, and people who are secular are not interested in living with people who are Haredi. Now, the reason why I think this is the case is because the Haredim assume that when they live with secular people, the secular people will have to follow their rules and their laws. And secular people know that in order for them to live their secular life, they can't have that Haredi population dictating how they can live their life. So while secular people want to have a life that's open and, have to go to restaurants on Shabbat and dressed unmodestly, that's an open society where people can do whatever they want. But the Haredim, who have a very, very strict set of guidelines that dictate how they live their life, they are open to having other people live amongst them, but the assumption is that people will follow their belief system and their culture. So I think what this tells us is that the people in Israel, they want to live their life as they see it and how they want to live their life, but they're not prepared to compromise that. And so you have that in these findings. I think that's very clear that while people are happy to live with other people, they're not prepared to give up their system of beliefs and their culture in order to do that.
Right. Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that Israelis want to live in a society where there's mutual respect and that they're not going to feel like one community is sort of imposing on the other. Is that what you would say?
I think there is a segment of the population, such as the Haredim, who assume that if they lived in mixed communities, their culture would be the one that's monopolized and would be dominant, which is why they have no problem saying, yeah, we don't mind secular people living in our community as long as they follow our community's guidelines. While secular people, they know, well, we don't want Haredim to live in our community because we don't want to have all our restaurants closed on the Sabbath, and we want to have buses that run on the Sabbath. So it's a split. It's a weird thing that the group in Israel that's the most secluded is the one that wants to have other people living amongst them.
Right. Well, we should make the distinction because you're talking about Haredim. Again, that's ultra-Orthodox. You ask a different question as far as secular Israelis and religious Israelis that are not necessarily ultra-Orthodox, but let's say modern Orthodox, conservative, observant Israelis, and those results were different. Am I correct that secular Israelis were open to living with observant Israelis, but not the ultra-Orthodox, as you just spoke about, those results?
That's correct. When asked that question, should secular and religious people live in mixed neighborhoods in Israel, the people who are totally secular, 47% said yes, that secular and religious people should live in the mixed neighborhoods. Now, 50% of people who are totally secular said no. But when you ask someone if they're, we give the option of totally secular and an option of secular traditional, which is people who you would look at and say, okay, this is a person who's not religious, but they may do some religious things such as not eat pork or, have a Friday night dinner. So something that, you wouldn't define them as being religious, but in their secular lives, there is some religious component to them. So those people were 69% in favor of living with religious people. And of the religious people who were asked, now this doesn't include the ultra-Orthodox, this is people who just say that they are religious. 81% of those people say they do want to live with secular people.
And it's interesting because this opens a whole nother conversation about Israel in general, and that is that perhaps when we say secular in the United States, we mean something a little bit differently. In Israel, when you are secular, you're still living the Jewish calendar in many ways because it's a Jewish state, and on Passover you will only find kosher for Passover things in the supermarkets for the most part. On Hanukkah you will find, sufganiyot or donuts in the store. Many secular Jews have some sort of a Friday night dinner as we think of it here in the U.S., but they don't consider themselves religious. So it's an interesting conversation. What is a secular Israeli? because in many ways, as you said, they do follow many of the Jewish traditions just because it is part of the day-to-day life in Israel.
Right. You stated it very, very well. It's certainly the case that in Israel, Israel is a Jewish state. I joke and I say I'm Jewish because I'm from Judah. That is what makes me Jewish. So, just like when I lived in Canada, we had Christmas, and schools were closed, and everyone knows Christmas is a holiday. But Christmas has become such a part of society such as Canada and America that people don't think of it as like a religious thing anymore. They just think of it as like almost a civic holiday. And in Israel, the same is true for totally secular people with the Jewish calendar. That it just makes sense that we have all the Jewish holidays off because these are the holidays that the state is built around. And what's interesting is the whole Jewish calendar is basically created in Israel, and it's based on the seasons in Israel. And it's what makes us the Jewish people, that we have all these customs and traditions. And it's very hard to say that Judaism is only a religion. That if you're a Jew, that's your religion. Well, it's not really the case, because many Jews, as you are well aware, are completely secular. And here in Israel, we found very interesting differences between someone who says that they are totally secular and someone who says they're secular with a little bit of tradition to them. And these differences are very interesting, and it says a lot about the society that, everyone, for example, on Yom Kippur, nobody drives on Yom Kippur. You will see very, 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 very few cars driving on Yom Kippur, and that's across the whole spectrum. But maybe there are people who are totally secular totally secular will not eat bacon. And you think to yourself, okay, they're not religious at all. They've never been to a synagogue, yet they don't eat pork. And it's a very interesting thing. And these are the small differences between the people who are totally secular and secular traditional.
Interesting. Now let's get back to that question about two communities living together, because you also asked this question of Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs in Israel, who responded somewhat similarly. You asked them, should those two groups live together, and what were those results like?
Right. I mean, these were even stronger. So amongst Muslims, it was 72%, definitely should not. Among Christians, it was 91%, definitely should not. So it's clear by these that Israelis, Jewish, Christian, Arab, they don't think they need to live in mixed communities. People, it's a very tribal, the Middle East is a very tribal area. And even though, and this is one of the most, happy findings, the most positive findings, is when you ask Israelis, both Arab and Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, are you comfortable being yourself in Israel? 80% of Arabs say yes, they are comfortable being themselves in Israel. I can tell you that 47% say they are very comfortable being themselves in Israel, and 27% say they're somewhat comfortable. But an overwhelming majority of Arabs and an overwhelming majority of Jews is even stronger, at about 80% of Jews, 90% of Jews are comfortable being themselves in Israel. But at the same time, they also prefer to live in communities of people who share their own religious and cultural beliefs. When we ask the question of should people who are on the left and right live in the same community, there was no question. Yes, people who are left and right should definitely live in the same community. That's not an issue that people care to separate from. Mizrahi and Ashkenazi, people who are of Sephardic background and European background. No problem. I think it's like 90% of the population says, yeah, we have no problem having these types of mixed communities. But when it comes to ethnicities, religious ethnicities, level of religiosity, and Christian Arabs and Muslims, people do not want to live in mixed communities. And I think it's practical. It's very practical. You want to be able to, if you're Jewish and secular, you want to be able to have buses. You want to be able to have non-kosher restaurants. And you don't want to be restricted whatsoever. If you're Christian and you don't want to live in a community where you're going to hear a muezzin, a mosque, a loudspeaker 5 times a day. So you live in a community that is predominantly made up of people of your own ethnicity, your own religious background.
Interesting. So let's get back to that question for a second that you asked about identity. And if Arabs feel comfortable, if Jews feel comfortable expressing their identity in Israel. And again, the majority of Arabs, which you said really is an incredible number, said that yes, they do. And they're living in a Jewish state, that the majority of Arabs feel comfortable expressing their identity, that they feel free to do so. But again, want to remain in their own communities, and Jews, the results from the Jewish communities being very similar, which again is an interesting sort of dichotomy. The fact that they want sort of that separation, and yet they feel very comfortable in Israel to be themselves. When they
right.
And I know your president, Avinoam Bar Yosef, said about the survey that the fact that many Arabs living in the Jewish state define their primary identity as Israeli and feel comfortable and at home in Israel is very encouraging. Let's talk about that for a second, about that Israeli identity.
Sure. So we asked of the Arabs, what is your central identity? And 59% of the Arabs say their central identity is Arab. 23% said their central identity is Israeli, and almost 15% said Palestinian, with another 3-4% that don't know or refuse to give an answer. So what's really interesting about this is, it's brought up a lot with the issue of the conflict with the Arabs, and how the question of, do we want to have Arabs living in Israel who really don't want to be here and they'd rather be living in under Palestinian control? Well, in our survey, we found that more Arab Israelis consider their primary identity as being Israeli than Palestinian. And this is a very positive finding. And going back to the question of how comfortable do you feel being yourself in Israel, even those Arabs who identify that Palestinian is their central identity, 41% of them are very comfortable being themselves in Israel. So even people who define their identity as not being Israeli are comfortable being in Israel, are comfortable living in Israel. So if I add up the two categories, somewhat comfortable and very comfortable, 64% of Arabs who identify as being Palestinian as their central identity are comfortable being themselves in Israel. So a Palestinian Arab being himself or herself in Israel feels comfortable. So that's a very interesting thing that, raises several questions about the conflict itself. And, one would think that, in a two-state solution compromise, the Arabs living in Israel would probably want to continue living in Israel and feel very comfortable living in Israel.
Right. So what is it that you asked people about the two-state solution? What were those questions and responses like?
We didn't really ask questions specifically about the peace process or anything like that. There are a number of surveys in Israel that looks at those questions. We asked a question that you could say it's somewhat of a proxy question. We listed all the types of groups in Israeli society. soldiers, secular people, Ashkenazim, Mizrahi, Kibbutznikim, Druze, national religious, Russian immigrants, Ethiopian immigrants, French immigrants, people who live in North Tel Aviv, all these different groups. We gave each person a chance to respond to the survey and say how each one of these groups contributes to the success of Israel. And even among the Arabs, the Israeli soldiers ranked quite positive. So among the non-Christian Arabs, so those are Druze, Bedouins, Muslims, they rated the contribution to the success of Israel by soldiers as a 3 out of 4, which is quite positive. An interesting finding is non-Christian Arabs, so Muslim Arabs, they think the group that contributes the most success to Israel is the residents of North Tel Aviv.
Interesting. How do you explain that?
I think you could say that residents of North Tel Aviv, they're upper middle class, they're working hard, they are probably friendly and easygoing, and I guess for some reason this is something that resonates really well with Arabs, and it's a group that they might want to emulate. That they say, okay, this is a population that's friendly and open and not extreme, and this is the type of Israel that we'd like to see for the whole Israel. And what's interesting, both the Arabs and most of the Jewish groups find that the Haredim contribute one of the lowest amounts to the success of Israel. So, for example, totally secular Israelis think that Haredim and yeshiva students contribute less to the success of Israel than they think Muslim Arabs do. So they think Muslim Arabs contribute more to the success of Israel than the Ultra-Orthodox do, which is quite fascinating considering the state subsidizes the Ultra-Orthodox living by a substantial amount. So, the Ultra-Orthodox make the argument that, we need to pay for their yeshivas because it's their contribution to the state. But actually, both the totally secular and the secular traditional Israelis give the Haredim quite a low score when it comes to their contribution to the success of Israel.
Interesting. And that may also, do you think, perhaps be as a result of a lot of policies that come out of the Israeli government that many non-religious Israelis or even religious Israelis, but not ultra-Orthodox, feel that there are a lot of policies, that the ultra-Orthodox have a lot of power in the Israeli government. There are many rules under the rabbinate in Israel that maybe not everybody feels comfortable with. So my take on what you just said is that maybe those numbers reflect some resentment or some feelings among Israeli society that, more from what happens in like government policies regarding things like marriage and divorce and conversion, as opposed to maybe the question that you asked. I'm just wondering if what you think about that, if there's been an impact on that.
Absolutely. I mean, you never know the reason people give responses on surveys. But you can pretty much surmise that the totally secular people and the traditional secular people are very unhappy with the amount of overrepresentation that the ultra-Orthodox get, especially in the current government. And their lifestyle. I think this contributes to why secular Israelis wouldn't want to live with Haredim, and why Haredim would think that secular people should live with them, because even though they're smaller in number than the rest of the population, they've been able to monopolize several policies in order for them to benefit the most.
Right.
So I think you're right to say that there's animosity and there's resentment and frustration.
Now, Noah, yourself, you made Aliyah, as you mentioned, from Canada about 9 years ago. How do you...
Yeah, it will be 9 years this July.
Okay, so how do you see the integration of Israeli society and the level of pluralism? I mean, through this survey, but also just through your own personal view, I'm wondering what your take is and if there's anything that really surprised you or if the results were kind of what you expected.
You know, it's interesting coming from a multicultural society like Canada and living in Israel. You would think, you know, Canada is so pluralistic, it's so multicultural, that it would be such a change coming to Israel. But the truth is Israel is such a diverse society that, you know, yes, there's, you know, 80% of the population are Jewish, but Jews come in all different colors and all different beliefs. And, you know, now more than ever, there's so many different foreign workers that are becoming more and more part of the Israeli fabric of society, that it is becoming a very diverse place. And pluralism, you know, we always have this argument at JPPI about what pluralism is. So, for example, if you're ultra-Orthodox and you want your child to have a school where girls and boys aren't in the same classroom, so it would be unpluralistic for the state not to provide that opportunity. Now, one can look and say, look, you have classes where boys and girls are not in the same classroom. How is that pluralistic? It's the opposite of pluralistic. And we find that there's this paradox of pluralism, and this is where you get the notion of reasonable accommodation. In a multicultural society, you hear this term of reasonable accommodation, that, you know, what is reasonable for the state to allow in order for people to feel comfortable. So in Israel, it turns out the answer is quite a lot. That even though, you know, a large majority of the population doesn't think it's acceptable to have buses where men and women have separate seating, there is a segment of the population that's important to them, and so there is accommodation made for those groups to be able to have that. Same with beaches. For example, you know, the ultra-Orthodox, they don't want to have beaches where men and women are together. So, you know, one can look at a beach where in the mornings it's for women, in the afternoons it's for men, and say, okay, this isn't very pluralistic. You have a beach where men and women can't go on at the same time. But on the other hand, for someone who's ultra-Orthodox, they say, okay, this is very pluralistic because, you know, I'm living my life the way I want, and someone else is living the life that they want, and we're not interrupting. I think, you know, there's always a problem finding the balance where everybody is happy.
Yes.
I don't think such a thing exists, but I think, you know, we're far from the craziness you saw last summer with the burkinis in France, and France outlawing women who fully cover themselves at the beach. I mean, I don't think such a thing would ever happen in Israel. For the reasons that, you know, it's a very pluralistic society where, you know, in order for the Jewish state to function, where Jews can all say they feel comfortable, like our survey shows, there needs to be a high level of accommodation.
Yes.
Even for someone like me who would say, okay, this is unreasonable accommodation. For people who look at it differently, they think it is a very reasonable accommodation.
Well, the survey certainly raises so many interesting issues, Noah. Thank you so much for sharing the results and for talking about it. I will wish you a happy Independence Day, and I hope we can check back with you in the future to talk more about some of these issues that the JPPI survey raised. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Noah Slepkov is a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, an independent professional policy planning think tank in Jerusalem. Thank you to him for joining us here on JBS, and thank you, as always, to our director and production coordinator, Sloan Copeland, JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, and our editors, Dennis Golan and John McDevitt. I'm Teisha Bader in for Mark Golub on this edition of In the News.